Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. I hope you're doing well and welcome to my room. Before I start with the deep stuff of this video, I want to remind you that I have written a book. I know that I have already been talking about it quite a bit, so I won't linger on it for too long. It's a novel, short novel, if you're interested in psychological fiction, a little bit like Franz Kafka, Dostoevsky, Albert Camus, these kinds of guys. And if you're interested to support a fellow INFJ, the links to the links to the various Amazon websites will be provided. It's less than $10, so very accessible. The interview, once again, thanks for your support. So in this particular video, I wanted to talk about, I guess, like TE, specifically in INTJs and ENTJs, and how to tell them apart from ENTJs and INTPs specifically. Although I think that most of the time the difficulties that can be experienced is in telling INTJs and INTPs apart. I think the reason for this is that ENTPs and ENTJs are quite recognizable a lot of the time. Maybe ENTPs more so than anybody else, because any dominant tends to be manifested in a way which people recognize easily. But it can get a little trickier with INTJs. And it can get a little bit tricky to distinguish them from INTP sometimes. I was inspired to make this video because I saw on the personality database website that on the profile of somebody like Elon Musk, for example, there's a lot of disagreements. I mean, the majority of the votes are INTJ votes, about 600 of them, but there's still like over 300 INTP votes, and that's not negligible. It suggests that there is a big disagreement as to whether he's INTJ or INTP. I will not turn this video into a discussion of Elon Musk's type, but what I do want to say is that there are ways of telling apart INTJs and INTPs. It can be tricky sometimes when an INTP's inferior FE is not too visible, because a lot of the time that's kind of how you recognize an INTP and how you tell them apart from an INTJ, because an INTP's inferior FE, when it's visible, it's quite recognizable, and an INTJ does not have it, so it can manifest itself in a kind of emotional naivety sometimes, or it looks like that, a kind of charming clumsiness in social relations. Now, INTJs don't have that. They have FI tertiary, which comes across as more private, a little bit cold sometimes, not all the time, sometimes. That's not really how the INTP inferior FE manifests. The famous, albeit maybe notorious, distinction in the meme between the coldest human, the INTJ, and the warmest machine, the INTP. So I don't agree with those, obviously, but it provides an interesting insight into the distinction between a tertiary FI and inferior FE. That being said, sometimes INTPs do not manifest this sort of awkwardly charming inferior FE. They do not seem to go into FE meltdowns, and in that case, often it's in that case that people struggle to determine whether they are INTPs or INTJs. They will tend to look for division, which is more often associated with INTJ because of NI, but when you look more into what vision means, it becomes quite clear that NE can be a visioning source just as much. I made a video about this before. And so I think that in these cases, you can really have a look at the distinction between the differences between TI and TE. I think that sometimes people struggle to tell them apart. It's a function that I used to think was one of the easier ones to identify, But I don't really think that's the case anymore. And the reason why I don't think that's the case anymore is because I have seen a lot of people hesitate and make mistakes when it comes to, identifying TI or identifying T. And I think part of the reason is that both of those functions are in some sense obviously rational, but also concerned with rigor. Both TI and TE can be concerned with rigor, rational rigor, if you like. But that's not going to be enough for you to tell whether, the function in question is TI or whether it's T, because both are rigor oriented in the sense. Both are meticulous in a sense. And too often people are prone to identifying this meticulousness, this rigor with TI. And because they assume that T focuses just on what works. Whatever works is what, T is interested in. And so it doesn't have to be too concerned with accuracy or rigor so long as it works. Now the problem is that that's quite a rough and somewhat rudimentary definition of T, and it will not allow you to tell it apart from TI, especially in the borderline cases, when an INTP really looks like an INTJ or the reverse. And so in these cases, I think it's good to think about the relationship between TI and TE as the symmetrical rational equivalent of the relationship between FI and FE. In a sense, both FI and TI are subjective and FE and TE are objective. I think that you could say that FI is concerned with the clarity, doing justice to emotional expression, internal emotional expression, doing justice to it. Whereas FE is more concerned with abiding by the social and emotional norms of the group. Well, in the case of TI and T, you can think about this difference as TI being concerned with doing justice to the clarity of expression and doing justice to the consistency of expression, whereas TE is more concerned with respecting the consistency of external systems. And so you can see that in one case the thinking comes from inside, subjective, and in the other case it comes from outside. But of course both can be very rigorous in their own ways. So it's not just that T is going to be concerned with what works, it's going to be concerned with what works best, but its criterion for identifying what works best is by trying it out, by comparing it with other systems, for example, and testing concretely in the outside world which one works best. And the number one criterion for selecting the most rigorous system is those external tests. Now, in the case of TI, of course there can be external tests, but TI will be first concerned to look at the internal articulation of the tests and see and check if it reflects the demands of its own internal logic, and it is on the basis of that adequation between the internal logic and the build of the test that it will proceed with its selection. So the external comparison will be important, but there is this first step, which is to test for consistency in the first place, not only with a view to finding what is best, but almost for its own sake, because it needs to have that reassurance about internal consistency. Now that criterion is very important to an INTP, it's very important to a TI user. It is not as important in the case of a TE user. The TE user will tend to be happy to look at what works best on the basis of these external test-based comparisons, and it's not likely to care as much about testing the internal consistency of the systems, especially if the output seems to be very good, seems to be the best that it can get, okay? So there is always this concern to start thinking about the internal consistency of a system if this is required by the external circumstances, whereas an INTP will have difficulty completely extricating themselves from this need to secure as much consistency as possible in the first place and in the sense for its own sake. And this is why you see also in a discipline like philosophy why almost all the philosophers, the rational philosophers who emphasized the importance of clarity, the importance of consistency, the importance of simplicity, who were dreaming of inventing a language which was as clear as possible. They're always INTPs, because INTJs, although they're capable of investigating those issues, have priorities that lie elsewhere and tend sometimes to see these questions as a little bit sterile at times. As in, they will think, well, why does it matter so much if it cannot be put to any practical use? What is the point of this, in a sense? It can be beautiful, but like if it's not practically usable, why do it? It's just the same reason why someone like Kant is seen as a quintessential INTP, especially by INTJs, because they think, oh, that's a beautiful ethical framework, it's a beautiful system of reason, but it's completely useless. Until you show them that it's actually been influential throughout history and it has this impact on the definition of human rights, has that impact on the contrast with the utilitarianism, and once they see that, they begin to appreciate its value. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into the difference between INTP's TI and INTJ's TE. But let me know in the comments if you like the video. Alright, see you guys. Take care.